For being here, and particularly for our panelists. I think it's been a really interesting discussion so far. I think we're going to get a lot of really good ideas out of this, and if it wasn't said before, the organizing group and a few others will be meeting tomorrow to try and start synthesizing some of the ideas that came out of this into a report that hopefully we will be able to put together in the very near future. If there is anybody else who would like to join our little group tomorrow morning from 9 to noon, let me know. Because we are trying to make sure that we get as many of the good ideas as we can together in that final report. Okay, so without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Rick Stuhlen, who will be the moderator for this third panel. It's a pleasure to introduce Rick, not only because he's the Chief Technical Officer and Vice President for Science, Technology, and Research at Sandia National Labs, but also because Rick is my boss in that role. I think this is going to be a very good panel to bring some of the ideas that we've heard home. Rick has been involved in tech transfer and partnership issues for a while, having been one of the key leaders with the extended ultraviolet lithography program that was run a number of years ago, and so I think he brings some specific insights into this arena, so look forward to this panel. Rick?
Thank you, Dwayne. And I'll say at the outset, I too am suffering, as one of the panelists was on the last panel, with a little bit of difficulty with my voice, so bear with me during the discussion here. It's a real pleasure to introduce this last panel, or next to the last panel for the day. The title of this panel is What's Needed Now? Partnerships for the Future. So our job, fellow panelists, is sort of start to pull this together and think about not only what we've heard today, but sort of how do we move this forward. I'm very pleased to introduce the members of the panel, and let me just start at my left with Larry Sumney. Larry, many of you know, I've known Larry for probably 20 years. Larry's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Semiconductor Research Corporation, SRC, which represents yet another model for industry, university partnerships, and in fact, in some way, the national labs as well. This is an enterprise that has been extraordinarily successful. It's been around for a while, and Larry has grown it from a fairly small enterprise to now something that is quite impactful across the nation, but focused on a very specific industrial sector. Larry began his career as a research physicist at the Naval Research Laboratory, and during his career also has had experience within the government. He was in the Office of the Undersecretary for Defense and Engineering, where he had responsibility for the creation, implementation, and management of the VISIC program. This was the early days of very high, large-scale integration in IC production for the Department of Defense. So he brings to this panel not only that government background and sort of the semiconductor industry background, but this unique model that I just mentioned. To the left of Larry, we have Dr. Susan Butts. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Susan. Susan is the Senior Director of External Science and Technology Programs at the Dow Chemical Company. In this capacity, she is responsible for Dow's contract research activities with U.S. and European government agencies and sponsored research programs at over 150 universities, institutes, and national laboratories worldwide. Having spoken with Susan, I know that she is very much in this same sort of mindset as the Procter & Gamble. Ideas proudly found elsewhere are just fine. And I think that perspective and sort of the emerging way that U.S. industry and Dow in particular is thinking about innovation is a piece that she brings to this panel. She was also co-founder and member of the steering team for the University Industry Partnership Project. This was an effort sponsored by the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academies. So again, she's got lots of experience in this field, so I hope to learn from her today. Thank you, Susan. To the left of Susan is Chris Hodder, who is Program Director of Economic Development for the National Governors Association. So again, what we've tried to do on this panel is to bring a state perspective, not only the sort of the federal and private, but also a state perspective. And Chris is going to help walk us through sort of what is on the minds of the governors, not a specific state, but sort of this sort of more of a cross-cutting view of where the governors stand today. He directs policy and legislative analysis, research, information sharing, and technical assistance services to states principally related to the economic development associated with the states and connecting with the universities in the states. Also notable is that Chris served as staff lead for Governor Janet Napolitano's Innovation America initiative, and we know that Governor Napolitano is now going to be a part of the new administration, and so I think sort of the thinking behind where she was going is, and the insights around that is something that Chris can bring to the discussion today. And then lastly, to the left of Chris, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ken Galloway. Ken is the Dean of Engineering at Vanderbilt, so he represents sort of an interesting perspective from the universities. He's not in the Chancellor's office, so we heard from the Chancellors this morning, and he's not a professor, so he's sort of the middle guy who can understand sort of what the top end is thinking and sort of the realities of where the professors stand and how they think within the universities. Ken's research and teaching activities concern solid-state devices, semiconductor technology, and radiation effects in electronics. Long list of kudos here. He's published many papers. He's a fellow of the IEEE, the AAAS, and the APS. Ken, welcome to the panel as well. So I thought I would start off with just a few observations of my own as we get into this discussion, and then we'll, as the other panels, I'll just turn it over to our panelists and we'll have a few comments and then some specific questions. I've been fascinated by this whole business of innovation in my career at the national laboratories, and as Dwayne had mentioned, had the opportunity and the pleasure of leading what still is the largest CRADA that the Department of Energy ever put in place, which was a $350 million partnership between national laboratories, universities, and industry. And at the time, which was the late 90s, mid to late 90s, we were unfortunately the ones to have to break a lot of ground in terms of foreign engagement, dealing with a Department of Energy culture that wasn't quite in tune with where industry was and wanted to go. I think the government and the universities have certainly come a long way since that time, but it, for me, was a fascinating experience in playing sort of the middle person in getting things to happen between government and the private sector and the university sector. Lots of challenges there. We as a group got together by phone a few weeks ago and sort of began to talk through some themes that we're going to touch on today that I think are quite interesting and fascinating, that have to do with, what are the successful ingredients of a partnership. So as you look forward, as you try to bring this together, what are those successful ingredients that we ought to be thinking about as we imagine this university, industry, national laboratory, or federal laboratory partnership model? First and foremost, there is a commitment issue. And this is sort of what men have a problem dealing with. But in general, it is a commitment of partners here. And the key is the key is here, what does each partner bring to the partnership? What is it? What is the essence of their commitment to the partnership that makes it work? It cannot be superficial. It has to be a very meaningful. It's got to be skin in the game. When you talk to universities and industry, getting them engaged means you've got skin in the game, not just I'm here to take your money and do some service work for you. So I think this whole notion of commitment and what does that mean in a partnership is something worth talking about. I would also observe that if you look worldwide and you look at what I consider successful models, there is a critical mass of partnerships above which you tend to be a successful enterprise, very successful enterprise. And I look at places like SRC, I look at Minitech, I look at ITRI, I look at IMEC in Belgium, you could look at KIST in Korea. These are enterprises that are typically hundreds of millions of dollars in size. Not 5 million, not 10 million, but these are significant enterprises. And with that size, with that critical mass, comes the ability to really start having an impact on an industrial sector or on a very important national problem. So we ought to think about that as well. I don't think successful partnerships in the future are going to be enabled largely by 500K grants by states and federal government, unless they are a part of a larger intentional funding programs. So there is something about size here. I would also say that my observation on the successful partnerships are that the ones that seem to flourish are the ones that are outcome focused. They have clearly in their mind why they exist, the value that they're trying to bring to an industrial sector or a community. So this notion of, it's not just nice research, but it's very clearly what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, what are the roadmaps. You look at these successful partnerships and they typically will have roadmaps and some good thinking around where they are, where they're trying to go, how they're incorporating the needs from the industry and the nation in what they're doing. So this real intentionality around outcomes is something that is, I think, quite important. And lastly, an interesting aspect of some of these, not all, but some of these, is that there is this intriguing combination of federal, state, and local interests that somehow tend to come together. I mean, I saw it at Minitech. In Minitech, for example, the mayor is very much a part of, mayor of Grenoble, is very much a part of Jean-Charles' enterprise. And you see that elsewhere, where the local community has a role to play. Oftentimes it's in helping with land, finding land, or tax incentives, or making connections with the local schools and so forth. But there is this sort of social network that also oftentimes comes into play that is, I think, quite interesting. So with that, let me lead off and ask the group to, starting with Larry, to sort of make a few comments. I think I would start the conversation here with the premise is that these tripartite partnerships are in fact a good thing, that there's a lot of power that can come from them, and yet the nation isn't quite there yet in terms of figuring out how we're going to actually incentivize them, as the Senator talked about this morning. So I'd like to start by asking each one of the panelists to just describe a little bit their perspective on the topic that we're discussing today, and also to address some of what they think are the best practices or critical ingredients to these successful partnerships. So Larry,
okay,
let's spend sort of probably 4 or 5 minutes in each case.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you about, I think, is a very important topic. I know I'm in the right place because he said it was about partnerships for the future, and that's what I'm prepared to make a few comments on. I want to start out by making 2 recommendations and then talk a little bit about SRC and then conclude with an overall conclusion that I think sort of ties everything together. First of all, I think on behalf of SRC and its members that include vocal advocates such as Craig Barrett, who many of you have heard, he speaks passionately about the need for improvement in public school education and the need for university research in this country. I strongly support the proposals to increase federal funding for physical science research. I think it's vital to our national economic security, and it's critical to solving challenges in energy, medicine, and the environment. We live in an interesting time. We live at a time where the scale of integrated circuit technology is converging with other areas such that you can see these different fields merging together. And one is integrated circuit technology with energy. One is integrated circuit technology with medicine. Nanobiomed is a term that is applied to a lot of these for diagnostics and implants and treatment, et cetera. And also with the environment, sensors and defense. It's just a huge convergence of this technology with a lot of fields that are important to society. Secondly, regarding partnerships, I believe strongly that the federal agency should invest a greater share of research funding in consortia-based research in partnership with industry. These investments are highly leveraged, they enhance technology transfer, and they attract high-caliber students in science and engineering. The SRC, I think, has a pretty good record of success and can serve as a model for how this can be done quite effectively. One thing I wanted to comment on, I picked up on a comment this morning that was made about the R&D tax credit. It strikes me that making the R&D tax credit permanent is a good idea, but expanding it to include a tax credit for those companies that engage in a collaboration involving a consortium, federal government and universities, I think would be a stimulus for more companies to get involved in these kinds of things. What we're seeing in the semiconductor industry, quite frankly, is the companies that started SRC pretty much have stuck with it unless they've been acquired or they've gone out of business for other reasons. But some of the newer companies coming on board really haven't seen the value of collaborative research. And maybe one of the ways this could be stimulated would be to provide an extra credit in the R&D tax credit that could be made permanent. Let me tell you a little bit about SRC. We think it's a successful one. It funds university research under contract for the most part, some grants, but 99% of what we fund is under contract on behalf of its members, which are related to the semiconductor industry, either infrastructure suppliers, fabless foundries. We're trying to get foundries. We just got one, but not the way we want it. I'll talk about it in a minute. Since its founding in 1982, we've invested about $1.3, $1.4 billion in university research. That's a sizable sum, and that hasn't just come from our members. One of the things that makes that number larger than you would think is because of the ability we've had in working with state and federal government. We've supported 7,400 graduate students. We've involved 1,700 faculty members. We've contracted with 242 universities. Now that's worldwide. You'll hear just in a moment. One of our programs is an international program, and so we are funding universities all over the world in this one program. So we've involved thousands of scientists in industry as reviewers, advisors, and mentors, and that's important, and particularly important if you're doing a little bit nearer term research rather than the most far out research. We've delivered over 42,000 technical documents, over 320 patents, and over 550 software programs. Let me just comment on patents for a second. From the beginning, we have had a policy that we provide to our members non-exclusive royalty-free access to the research that they fund. Before we commit to a contract with the university, we would like for the background intellectual property that currently we're asking the PI to identify background intellectual property that he thinks would be relevant to what he's going to do. And if there's blocking IP associated in that background, then industry makes a decision as to whether they want to fund the research or not. If they do want to fund it, then they're willing to pay whatever royalties are involved in that background. Two-thirds of the graduates that have come out of our research program have stayed in the semiconductor community, either in industry itself or joining a faculty or coming to the federal government. In 2007, we received the National Medal of Technology for what we've accomplished. The critical elements of our success include planning where we wanted to go. From the very beginning when we started SRC, we would identify a research goal and then outline the research steps that needed to be taken to get to that point where we could demonstrate, and this is how Semitech started. We were trying to find a way to demonstrate that we had gotten to where we wanted to go. So the idea for Semitech originated with us, and it went off in a slightly different direction than that, but that's fine. But we thought that that was important, and out of that planning for research, identifying a target, identifying research needs to get there, that led to, over a series of several different iterations, the International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. We have always had the policy of investing in the very best research. If you invest in the very best research, pick the very best faculty members, the very best proposals, that attracts the very best students. And in that way, you can provide greater value in the output to your members, because the members get the research results and they get a facilitated access to the graduate students that we provide so that they can hire them. We provide user feedback in various ways by industry so that we build a communication channel between the industrial members and the universities and the federal agencies and state agencies if they're participating. SRC now is an overbrand, and we have, I'm just going to briefly say we have We have more than this, but I'm going to mention 4 programs. One of them is the GRC, which is international, near term, has the greatest industry involvement in its management. The next one is the Focus Center Research Program, longer term, intended to take the CMOS transistor to its ultimate theoretical limits, and that we anticipate that will happen in around 2018, 2020. And then the next one is the NRI, the Nanoelectronics Research Initiative. That's looking for what's going to succeed and work with CMOS circuitry. And we're looking for what we call the next switch. What's it going to be other than this CMOS transistor? And then we have a program called Topical Research Collaboration, where we're focusing on new kinds of things, many of which may involve the convergence of semiconductors with other fields, such as medicine. Start a small research program there. Sign up members that may or may not belong to anything else SRC is doing. Engage the federal government and state governments. I have to say that with the NRI, we have a major center in New York, a major center in Texas, a major center in California, and a major center at Notre Dame in Indiana. And there we not only got Indiana state government leverage, but the city of South Bend. The city of South Bend put in $1 million, which I thought was pretty substantial. And that's the first time we've ever gotten leverage from a city. We've worked with NSF, probably was the first federal agency that we worked with. We work very much with DARPA on the Focus Center program. We work with NIST. We work with the national labs and the Department of Energy. So we have pretty good exposure at this point to federal agencies, and we work with a lot of states. So why is the research consortium model a good idea now? The very first thing that comes to mind is it improves the effectiveness and the efficiency of the federal investment. With more and better research worldwide, U.S. research is, the enterprise needs to be optimized, get the most value for the money invested. By focusing the research, knowing what you're looking for, having deliverables under contract from the universities, reviewing those deliverables. We do this all interactively on our website, and face-to-face reviews. And getting the user-inspired perspective on whether this research is going in the right direction or whether we should change the direction makes the research more valuable to everybody, the universities, the government, when they're involved, as well as industry. Fully utilize a growing research capability and capacity. We see every time we go out, we ask for white papers first. We see an abundance of excellent white papers that come in. We downsize that considerably into a request for proposals. And when we go out and ask for proposals based on those white papers, again, we downsize from there. So there's a huge unfunded capability out there in the university system involving very good ideas that's not being funded. And I think that if we could enlarge this consortial approach to this, there is a large capacity out there to really do a lot better research. We increase the likelihood of technology transfer. We have various mechanisms in the different programs. I'm not going to go into that. But the real method of technology transfer is to hire the student. And if you stop and think about it, you often hear about the valley of death where the funding goes up and then it goes down, everything dies, and nobody picks up on it. Actually, when you work with SRC, the valley of death is eliminated because we associate industry with the research as it progresses. And when the graduate students are ready to graduate, their resumes are on a website. We have face-to-face meetings between industry and the students, and they can be hired, and then they go on to industry. And industry tells us repeatedly these are the very best graduate students they can hire. And so that's a way to grow the pool of scientists and engineers. It's a win-win-win for everybody when you involve these three pillars of society, the federal government and the state governments, industry and universities. It works exceedingly well, and it can be made to work even better. So my overall recommendation is that we can improve the direction and relevance of basic research. Now, that's not to say we don't need blue sky research. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that we need to increase the amount of research that is done through a consortial-based program like SRC to make it relevant so that industry can immediately begin to use it, hire the graduate students, and give them good opportunities in their career. through the establishment of these industry-driven consortiums in partnership with the government and with industry. And the consortium provides effective and efficient management of this overall effort, be it a major program or a smaller one like our TRCs that we're doing. And I just think it's an excellent way to increase the value of the dollar for the federal government and from industry. The leverage on some of these programs is absolutely incredible for each of the participants. Some small company comes in and joins SRC, they have leverage 100 to 1, 150 to 1, 1,000 to 1. Now, it's like a sponge. They can't absorb it all, but they certainly get good leverage on their money. So that concludes what I have to say.
Thanks, Larry. Susan.
Yes, thank you very much, Rick and Larry. And I'd like to build on some of the comments that have already been made by my previous speakers, and thank Chris Hill for teeing up some of the issues here and for the last panel. Let me start with some real positives. I think the U.S. is actually in a wonderful position to transform itself to be the most innovative, most competitive country in the world. And the reason is we already have the basic resources. We have more than our fair share of the best research universities in the world. We have world-class national laboratories, and we have companies both large and small that have great research and innovation capacity. So we start with the right ingredients. I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on the industry-university interface, but I think many of them are also relevant to that interface with the national labs. If we look at the university-industry interface, there's some pieces there that are working really well. Larry, you mentioned students. If we look at technology transfer in the broadest sense, most of it happens in two ways. One is through companies hiring students, and one is through company scientists reading journal articles and going to presentations given by faculty members. Those two pieces work really well. And they're actually, if you think about it, well in alignment with the university mission. The principal mission is education, and another mission of universities is generation and dissemination of information. Those pieces are working well. And if you stop and think about it, most universities don't have to try to encourage companies to come and recruit their students. In fact, companies compete to hire their students. Companies don't have to try to get their scientists to read the literature. They do that willingly because they see a direct benefit from that type of an activity. Where we see, I think, the friction is where the missions are not quite so clear, or in fact there's a potential conflict or competition between the missions, and that happens more when we get into companies spending their own dollars to sponsor research with universities because they're worried about their access to the intellectual property that comes from that sponsored research. Companies are investing their research dollars for the benefit of their owners and shareholders, so they have to be concerned about the return. And the conflict can also happen where companies want to license technology that universities developed with federal funding. And I think the reason is that those negotiations of licenses are between inherently asymmetrical partners. So universities don't do developmental research and they don't commercialize products, so they are forced to try to determine a priori some kind of a fair share of the benefit if a technology is commercialized. On the other hand, the company is going to carry all the risk and all the cost of doing the commercialization. So they're saying, well, what is a fair share of the benefit when you didn't have to take any of the risk? And companies are also faced with the problem that roughly 1 in 10 of their projects are successfully commercialized, so the winners have to pay for the losers. So this whole exercise about what's fair becomes very difficult to manage. And so I think what we're seeing there is where the universities are almost more in competition with the companies, we see the friction. One of the things I challenged myself to do before this presentation today was to say, well, if I could, how would I make it different? And I wanted to throw out a suggestion since we're focusing on what do we need now to make this better. And that is, if in the sense of especially licensing federally funded inventions to companies, the universities could operate in a mode where they're offering inventions to companies who will pay the cost of the patenting and maybe a very modest upfront fee. If there's only one taker, that's what it costs, because that's apparently the market value or the perceived value of the invention. But if multiple companies are interested, then you have companies bidding against each other. And there you have a symmetrical kind of situation because companies are all doing risk-benefit calculations. They're all trying to figure out, do they have an advantage relative to market or technology that would allow them to get a bigger profit margin and spend perhaps a bit more on a license. So I think if we could work toward a situation where the emphasis is on trying to get as many technologies as possible out into companies to try to develop them, recognizing that not all inventions coming from universities are going to be commercializable or have value, that we could sort of get beyond where we're stuck now, where we have a lot of metrics that are based, in fact, on dollars. I wanted, in fact, to share with you something that I just saw in my email last night at 6 o'clock, just before I went home, because I think it's particularly relevant to our discussion. And it has to do with metrics. So this is the lead item in a publication called Tech Transfer eNews. And it's a very brief description of a publication which I hadn't seen until I downloaded it last night, called Intellectual Property and Research Benefits by Professor Paul Wellings, who's Vice Chancellor at Lancaster University. And it's a report prepared for the Right Honorable John Denham, Member of Parliament, Secretary of State for Innovation, Universities and Skills in the UK. And this article says, eNews came across a rather stunning set of benchmarks comparing the results of university tech transfer in the UK against Australia, Canada, and the US. The report, which Welling stresses represents his personal opinions, offers a host of recommendations for UK universities to improve their IP management policies and practices. But it also presents the data shown below, which dispels the myth that UK institutions lag far behind their US counterparts in moving research out of the lab and into the marketplace. In fact, in several key categories in the 5-year period between 2000 and 2004, UK institutions produced significantly better results. With a denominator of $100 million in research expense, the UK far outperformed the US in license and option agreements executed, the number of license and option agreements yielding income, and the number of startups formed. In the latter category, UK schools produced more than 3 times the number of startups per $100 million in research expense than US institutions. But the data also reveal an equally glaring differential in the dollar value of the UK deals. Despite the higher number of licenses, total income generated pales in comparison to the US. So I think what this points to is that in the US we focused a lot on the metric for successful tech transfer being dollars in licensing revenue. What if our metrics instead are numbers of technologies that are sent into industry for development and potential commercialization? What if our metrics are a number of inventions that are turned into products that people can use? And on that note, I want to share one final thing with you. Last week, the University Industry Demonstration Partnership had a meeting here in Washington. And one of the things that we tried to do in UIDP is to have companies and universities share things that they're doing that they feel are good for the community. And we had 2 great presentations, one by Eric Gigerich of the University of Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and one also by his boss, Carol Maimora, who's head of the Office of Intellectual Property and Industry Research Alliances. And they talked about the rather revolutionary new model that they're using at Berkeley to try to drive more collaborations. And the first thing that happened was they tried to shift their focus from transactions, like a licensing deal, to a relationship focus. And they're trying to encourage long-term relationships. And their reasoning is single transactions don't build relationships. Long-term relationships foster repeat engagements. So they're trying to look at the bigger picture. And in doing that, they recognized that it was beneficial to have the Office of Technology Transfer and the Office of Sponsored Programs be reporting to the same person, so that rather than having, say, tech transfer officers trying to preserve potential licensing revenue at the expense of sponsored research, in fact, what they were looking at was the integrated benefit to the university. And in fact, they've gone beyond just that kind of a benefit. In fact, their new metric is all aspects of university industry partnerships. And they're looking to the total industry contribution to the campus, which is funding, know-how, data, materials, equipment, confidential information. They consider licenses, they consider the number and variety of repeat engagements, so that's the same company coming back again. They look at industry advising, market feedback, deployment, industry internships and hiring, and social impact and public good. And I can tell you, I don't have the statistics on how Berkeley's fared since they actually made these changes, but I can tell you that 2 years ago, my company, the Dow Chemical Company, had no sponsored research agreements with Berkeley. We did hire their students. We had a small amount of philanthropy that was related to our recruiting. Since Berkeley's change in their approach, we now have 6 multi-year sponsored research programs running. We're hiring more of their students. We've increased our philanthropy. In fact, Dow donated a number of millions of dollars to start a Center for Sustainable Chemistry at Berkeley. One of our senior scientists did a 1-year sabbatical in the chemistry department at Berkeley to spend time with faculty and students. And one of our commercial directors is now sitting in the Haas School of Business. So I think if we have the courage to not be driven by the sorts of metrics that focus us on transactions and instead look at the broader relationships, that there is in fact a path forward to really improving our competitiveness and increasing innovation.
Thank you, Susan. In fact, I think we heard something similar from the Minitech model, where both of those functions that you just described sort of report up through the same office. Yeah. Chris?
So it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd provide just a little bit of background about NGA and the NGA Center. Actually, it's been a lot of fun working in NGA. I've been there about 3 years, but I've been in D.C. about 10 years. And being at NGA, the National Governors Association, allows you to work with governors, but not in governors' offices, which is especially useful this week if you're in the Illinois governor's office. But
especially in Illinois.
That's right, in Illinois. The National Governors Association is the association of the nation's governors. We have 55 members, so 5 states and commonwealths and 5 territories. We were founded in 1908 by Theodore Roosevelt. Right when he became president, he had, of course, been governor of New York. It really saw a disjuncture between federal and state policy making ever since, well, the Civil War. And so a lot of what we've talked about today, I think, has been focused on the dyads of universities and companies, and in some cases the federal government. But I think, too, that just as Theodore Roosevelt saw a gap in the federal and state government, really what I try to do is also link not just understanding, but also the policies that interact between states and the federal government as it applies to this university industry piece. The NGA Center was created in the early 80s, and whereas NGA represents a lobbying organization representing the governors up on Capitol Hill with regard to federal policy, the NGA Center is focused on state policy. So my counterparts in governors' offices are typically at the policy advisor level. And by the way, I don't have many counterparts. Many states do have policy advisors for economic development, but very, very few have policy advisors for post-secondary education. And by the way, those policy advisors for economic development are not necessarily focused on the things we're talking about here. It's typically retention, attraction, buffalo hunting, trying to get the next big plant into your state. Post-secondary education is also an interesting field relative to the governors, relative to other policy priorities. And what I mean by that is, so at NGA we've tracked for at least as long as the center has been around, which is about 30 years, the relative policy priorities of the governors. So as you can imagine, the top 2 are typically K through 12 and health, depending on the year, as far as what's mentioned in the governor's state of the state and or legislative outcomes. It's a rough mix. Post-secondary education really hasn't gotten much play at all, and with the exception of a blip right after World War II, and then of course a blip in the 60s and 70s around the creation of the community colleges. But relative to everything else, it's been very, very low on the totem pole. The interesting thing is that's actually changed, and it's changed drastically in the past 2 to 3, 5 years. But it's for very different reasons than states originally began to fund higher education in the late 1800s. Yes, states states chartered universities, and they also built buildings, but states did not give annual appropriations to the university systems until roughly the late 1800s, depending on the state. But really, since that time, it's been the way that higher education has been funded has typically been, and public higher education has been more of a tuition subsidy, and we can debate what that means, but for the most part, it's to defer cost and tuition at the institutions. The reason that governors are interested today are very much more pragmatic in the sense of how do we get more math and science teachers into our classrooms? How do we get more nurses on the hospital floor? And what's this thing called economic development? So the good news is that governors are interested in post-secondary education. The bad news is, well, governors are interested in post-secondary education. Now, the problem, as I see it, so some of the real challenges with involving as states get more and more interested and governors get more interested in the area is really a capacity to understand these very, very complex issues. So the stuff that Susan just outlined, the very important technical details of a patent between universities and industry, I mean, really, if you have no background, many governors are business people, or they're legislators, again, there's really a lack of understanding of this very, very complex world that is a university. And by the way, new economic development, which in the sense that innovation matters, that it's driven by R&D. So that is a real fundamental challenge in understanding what these, this relationship between universities and economic development is. And it's really washed over by a number of problems. I think some of the earlier speakers talked about, Medicare, Medicaid funding, budgetary issues. If there's one thing that I've learned, that which legislators do not understand, they cut. And so if they don't really understand it, and that doesn't have a constituency, by the way, and competitiveness, that's one of those things that doesn't have a constituency, they're going to cut it. And so I think that's the reason that higher education funding has gone down, and it has gone down, at least relative to inflation, is really, again, really understanding the contributions of these areas. Language and paradigms, I think, is another really critical area that needs to be addressed. And so I think for some reason along the way, and I think it was largely driven, no offense, by a lot of the research universities, it's that economic development only happens in research universities, that there's a link between research and economic outcome, which there's not, by the way. I mean, there's social benefits, but there's no direct economic benefit from basic research. I mean, study after study have shown that. But I think the real problem is that it creates expectations, not just for research universities, but it creates expectations on, by the way, that other 98% of post-secondary education institutions that are out there, community colleges, your four-year former teacher schools, your comprehensive universities. And so I also think that what happens is the real problem, the real competitiveness challenge, or in my mind, the real competitiveness challenge, is not something related to research. It's research for the purpose of what? And by the way, the bigger problem is attainment. And someone did mention that earlier. So I think that's the real critical piece. And that's something that goes beyond research universities. It's something that happens at high school. So Dr. Wulf mentioned, the technical high school earlier, but also community colleges. It's a very complex issue. So what are the linkages that the federal government has with attainment, with those issues? Well, yes, certainly how R&D is funded. I mean, that certainly matters. But also Pell Grants, also the way the financial aid is funded. And then again, how the states actually do that. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully we can have some conversation along those lines.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Ken.
Rick, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. In my position, I probably sit a little bit closer to the students and the faculty than most of the people that you've heard from. And so I want to advocate for the foot soldiers who make these partnerships come to life. The PhD students, the young PhD researchers, the junior faculty. I think we need to change the way, the policies that we have in place and the support structure that we have in place for PhD education in the STEM fields. I think we need to change the way we support junior faculty if we really want to see these people be part of these partnerships. I'm sure many of you have read Innovation Nation by John Cow. And to quote, human capital is a primary key to a national success strategy. My colleague at Vanderbilt, Dennis Hall, has been recommending that we create a federally funded full-pay fellowship program for graduate students in all of the STEM fields. We should award a fellowship to any U.S. citizen admitted to a recognized STEM PhD program. It should include a stipend plus the tuition for up to 5 years. And certainly it could be managed by SRC-like companies to make this work. educating PhDs in the STEM fields is one of the most important elements of our national infrastructure. STEM field PhD graduates truly define and shape the future. They are the innovators. Just consider what's happened with the transistor, which Larry's taking to its very limit in CMOS technology, created by 3 PhDs. But there is no predefined future that says we need a specific number of PhDs in any area. But given the opportunity, these PhDs would create a future. Now, in general, there is no directly identified revenue source for PhD education in the STEM fields. In most instances, if you are a student in science and engineering, if you are a graduate student in science and engineering, you pay no tuition. And at most universities, certainly at our university, tuition pays for education. So only a small portion of the tuition cost can be charged to faculty grants and contracts. Stipend support pays for living expenses, not for education. So PhD education is subsidized from a number of other sources, and I think long term this is a rather unstable way to fund something that I believe is so important to our future. I think we should recognize STEM PhD education as a recognized national priority. Now, how much would it cost to do this? If we assume we graduate about 10,000 PhDs per year in the STEM fields in this country, if we assume that we're graduating 10,000 and that there are 50,000 in the pipeline, this translates to a cost of about $2 billion a year. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but I think it's a small price to pay to ensure that the STEM field PhD educational enterprise in our country will be sound. We spend $300 billion a year in R&D in this country. The combined budgets of NSF, NIH, and DoD 6.1 currently is greater than $35 billion a year. And in the bigger picture, $2 billion per year is a small percentage of a $3 trillion annual budget. Now, what about junior faculty? In a given year, there are 3,000 proposals to the Science Foundation for career awards. 1 in 5 of those will be funded. And at NIH, as was pointed out earlier, the average age to win the first R01 is 42 years. I see daily how discouraging this can be to junior faculty. A declining number of U.S. nationals are attracted to academic career of teaching, research, and mentoring graduate students. I think if we want to establish an effective environment to greater partnerships between universities, industry, and government, we really need to change the policies whereby we support these students and the young faculty members involved.
And Ken, do you see that change as incentivizing partnerships?
I certainly could be, and it could certainly be managed by an organization similar to the SRC.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me bring us back to the commitment question, because I want to get a little bit of discussion on this. And Susan, if I could, let me move to you first. You made a very interesting point about sort of this notion of moving from transaction to relationship, which I didn't know Berkeley was doing this. This is great. I've seen it at some other schools as well. And so here we're moving this commitment piece now starts to emerge into a relationship sort of space. Can you say anything more about the successful partnerships, again, that you've had at Dow, and the commitment that the partners bring to that, and in what form does that commitment sort of show up?
Right. I think in almost all successful partnerships, the key element is that each of the partners is supporting the mission and the success of the other one. So I think whenever you have a relationship that doesn't support the mission of one of the parties, that ultimately it's going to fail. It becomes an exploitation rather than a partnership. So finding that sweet spot where what a company wants to do and a university or a national lab wants to do overlap, and they can each achieve their goals through a well-constructed relationship and partnership is the real key. But to go back to Chris's point, if companies don't understand the key missions for universities and are asking them to do things that are in conflict with their mission, then it's you're probably, that one's not going to even get off the ground. And a lot of what I do, since I'm with a company, often people from companies come to me and they talk about their problems in working with universities. And part of what I'm trying to do is educate them. For instance, I've had people say, well, how can I get the university to agree not to publish the results? And I say, you shouldn't ask them to do that because it's a fundamental part of the university mission is to disseminate information. So if this is work that can't be published, then don't take it to a university. Or I'll give you an example that we've used at Dow. Maybe we have proprietary compounds that we're doing some university research on. We'll also provide a second set of model compounds and pay for 2 parallel tracks of the research and say you can publish the results on the model compounds, but on our proprietary compounds you won't publish. Yeah. So I think you first have to understand and be supportive of the success of your partner, and then you can almost always find a way to make it work.
Okay, great. So it's beyond just sort of a service kind of a relationship. There has to be sort of, at your core mission for each one of the partners, a value proposition that this partnership brings. Any other thoughts or comments from the group on this? Or has Susan pretty much captured it? Okay. Before we open it up to questions, let me just walk through the panel and just very quickly like to ask you for sort of 1 minute or less, if you had your wish list, Christmas is coming up, if you have your wish list, on the top of the wish list, 1 or 2 items that you would like to see as an, an outcome from in the next 6 months or year, either with the new administration or with your Governors Association or your company, what would that be? So, Larry, you've already given us, I think, maybe some specifics. But
I can, 1 or 2 years sort of changes the perspective a little bit. I think that there's a number of companies that exist that do not understand the importance of research to their future. And so I think instilling a sensitivity to the importance of research is important. This R&D tax credit idea that I mentioned may be one way to stimulate more investment in research, but there's also a public cultural thing. Whenever a company announces that they're increasing their research budget, their stock plummets because the public thinks that's a total waste of money.
Right.
It isn't. It's the future of the company, and this just has to change. We have greatly changed the need for companies to have to do research through the kinds of things that we've discussed today, through the 3-pillar consortial idea. It's not necessarily the companies that have to do their own research. They can leverage each other's investment and work at the pre-competitive research area. So that's one thing that I think needs to change. We have to appreciate research. I also think we need to increase the pipeline of students coming out of our public school system. That's not going to be done in a year, but it's something that has to be done, because if it isn't, the kind of thing that Ken is talking about, it's not going to be enough to dump more money into our current public education system. That's not the answer. It may need more money, but not the current system.
Okay. Susan?
I guess if I could get my top item on the wish list, it would be a recognition and understanding on the part of governments, federal and state, that innovation is a hard and risky thing, and that one of the roles they can play is to provide the right environment and the right incentives to encourage collaborations, to encourage private investment, and to really incentivize people to try the hard projects, because they're the ones that ultimately lead to the big breakthroughs.
Great. Chris?
I'd say long-term, sustained conversation led by, let's say, a few enterprising governors, from my standpoint, about the common goals, needs, and policy implications in the relationship between states and the university systems. And definitely towards economic development, but the general relationship. I mean, there are a lot of people in universities who may not have something of interest to a Dow Chemical, but they certainly do important things that would be of use in the community.
Right. And Ken?
Full funding of America Competes.
Okay. Simple thing there.
Simple.
Okay. All right, let's, open up the floor to questions. And where are the roving microphones here? I think in the back first.
I guess it was talked about a little bit by the first panelist and his wish list about public education. And I guess at the Baker Center, we've been getting involved a lot in kind of the grassroots inner city elementary schools. And I think Congressman Gordon mentioned the test scores among fourth graders and eighth graders. And I'm surprised that I haven't really heard more conversation about what needs to happen in the public schools. And I'm sure the gentleman from the NGA probably has a little bit something to say about what's going on in K through 12, because that's what the states are doing. They have to, the federal government doesn't necessarily have too much of a hand in funding the public education. Sure, nuances here and there, but anyway, what needs to happen to get students excited about STEM? What are the partnerships maybe that need to happen between industry, government, and national labs and universities that go into the public schools and teach these foundation type skills that allow our students to have some kind of basic understanding of STEM fields? I don't know. I feel like, where does education fit into this, kind of the K-8, K-12, because the students who are getting their PhD, they're already there. They're already interested. They're motivated. They might need funding, but they're already there. I'm worried about the students who don't have a basic understanding when leaving our public schools. So can you talk a little bit about where we need to go, K-12, but specifically even younger, K-8?
Yeah, I think there is a role for these three entities to get engaged, provide role models for the younger students so they can actually see that there is a there, that they're actually real people that are excited, that do interesting things. The government has, by and large, at least within the Department of Energy, significantly reduced the amount of funding for the national laboratories, at least in that sector, to engage with the K through 12. Believe me, the scientists and engineers in these laboratories love to do this. And there's nothing more impactful than a scientist coming in to a classroom and talking to students. So it is, it's a very positive and powerful experience. What's needed there is a focus, at least for the national laboratory sector, a focus by the government to enable that to happen. That means funding to make that happen. It's quite simple. Because there is no lack of enthusiasm, I will tell you.
Even beyond that, what about curricular? What about curricular change? What needs? Is there something right now that's not happening with the formulation of a curriculum? The testing. How can we get our test scores up? I don't know. Like in the classroom, I know the career fairs and things like that, and having role models to look up to is a part of it. But what about every day, the teaching that goes on in our classrooms?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right one to talk about that, but maybe Ken, anybody have a comment?
Well, I can say I think Dr. Wulf actually had it. If you look at sort of SHOP 2.0,
yes.
If you look at alternative learning pathways for kids, and you look at the outcomes for career, they're called CTE programs, career and technical education programs that are done well, it's phenomenal. It's better than the college-going kids. These kids don't typically go to a four-year school. They go to community college or to a job. But the outcomes are amazing, and it just not only do we need to be innovative. In general, we need to be innovative in our public structures. But the other piece, too, is I think that at a state level, there's so many interesting partnerships that are trying to explore this very question. And then you have federal partnerships. So at a community college level, you have things like the NSF ATE program. But what's always struck me is that with the exception of a few states, there's very little coordination between an ATE program and a broader state sort of STEM strategy, if you will. And so I think that that's another real opportunity, is one, understanding what the heck's going on in states from the federal government standpoint, and vice versa. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay, let's see. There was some other question. Phil?
Thank you. My name is Phil Bujak. I'm the Vice President for Research at North Dakota State University. And Dr. Sumner, I would like to hear more about the nature of the contracts that you have with faculty at the different universities in which SRC is engaged.
Well, they range all over the place. In the GRC program, we have university centers. For instance, we have one at the University of Albany on packaging. We have one coming up to Georgia Tech on packaging. A center usually engages other universities to provide the full range of capabilities needed. We have task-level research in GRC, which works with a professor and one or two graduate students and provides a very specific problem for them to address. And we involve industry in all of this as it progresses. So the scope of the research varies significantly in size, and it varies significantly in the technical area. We do research in design, circuit design, system design, architecture, processing, nanomanufacturing, a whole range of technical areas that we do research in the GRC, and that carries over into the Focus Center program as well. In the Focus Center program, we're trying to break down the technical barriers, areas where we do not know the answers for how do you increase mobility in the channel to a greater than it is now. How do we do that? We're not sure how to do that. So we're trying to break down barriers on how to do that.
One of the barriers for universities in contract research, of course, is the IP. And so on these, does your contract for the research involve a transfer of all of the IP to SRC and to that entity?
No, we review, as things are published and as we review the research as it's ongoing, we identify things that we feel that would be valuable as IP, and then we pay the university to file. The university owns it, and the industry gets non-exclusive royalty-free access to it.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions? Right here.
Thank you. Mr. Sumney, you went to SRC in the early 80s.
82.
This topic of this discussion today has been about competitiveness nominally, and I've heard a lot about research, I've heard a lot about innovation, I've heard a lot about workforce development, but competitiveness kind of infers that we are competing against somebody in some things, and the environment has changed since you took over this organization, started this organization back in 82. The Japanese competitiveness threat in Europe was kind of clear at the time. We knew we wanted to, as a nation, build our strength and compete globally. So my question is, even if we do all the things that we've talking about successfully, which were the challenges we faced in the 80s in terms of developing a strong research base, bringing it to market, doing innovation, how do we successfully as a nation capture the value of the investments you're talking about?
Well, it depends on the technology. If you look at the semiconductor industry, what has driven the semiconductor industry to succeed in research is the roadmap. The roadmap provides these research needs, and you actually end up, believe it or not, with companies competing to see who can get to the next node first, who can develop the manufacturing technology based on the pre-competitive generic research to get to the next node first. They've actually accelerated the cadence of achieving Moore's Law up to today. Now, we're running into some fundamental problems, and I'm not sure whether that will continue or not. But I guess the answer to your question is, I think it's a great idea to have some sort of plan to take you where you want to go. You need to understand where you are today and where you want to go in 10 years, and then develop a plan. You can call it a roadmap, you can call it a research needs plan, whatever it is, and then you start funding the steps to get you there. You're right, when SRC started, it was a competitiveness issue throughout the world about who was going to be the leading manufacturer, because we didn't know how to manufacture. It's no longer that. It really is competing against advancing the technology. The technology is the issue. You're trying to beat the technology, solve the problems that need to be solved. That's an attitude that has developed.
Hi, Duncan McBranch.
Is there a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess the question is, I apologize, but I guess the point is we've invested nationally because we're trying to create economic growth and jobs within this nation, and we have argued strongly that the very kind of investments you're talking about in basic research and technology innovation and workforce development are the things that lead to the value that create the jobs and economic growth in the nation. And we can do these innovations, but we have, as we've talked about earlier today, a flattened earth, if you will, the ability for companies and organizations to basically tap scientists and engineers being developed in India or China, or to reach out and do manufacturing in places. So the question is, if we do the whole innovation process, and I've seen any number of circumstances where the federal government has contributed to the development of new and innovative technologies, but we seem to be losing important pieces of the value chain as that technology goes elsewhere for manufacture, elsewhere for development. So I guess my question is, I haven't heard much discussion about how we as a nation capture the economic and job benefits of all these type of activities we've been talking about today.
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer your question in a concise way. I think it's important. It's a good question. I think you really need to understand the significance of some manufacturing going overseas. Is that really important or not? Should we continue to innovate and move things forward, and then if manufacturing is done better somewhere else, maybe we ought to do that? I don't know the answer to. It's a specific problem for each time it happens. I still think the only thing we can do is to continue to innovate, and as long as you continue to innovate and you have good engineers and scientists working to do it, and you do it through the pillar system, you do it effectively and efficiently, you're going to be ahead. You just have to run faster than everybody else.
But I think this gets back to the language of competitiveness in general, and it's faulty. I mean, it doesn't work. If we're here in Washington D.C. talking about what the policy aspects of innovation is, but again, who's the constituency? And I think if we gave some thought to framing this in more of a person-centric, I think the Europeans are much better at framing things in terms of quality of life, in the sense of how is this going to benefit not competitiveness but the individual. What's their education level? Are they healthy? Do they have a good diet? And those are things that matter, and those things add up to competitiveness, because you're only as strong as your people are. And I think that we have this propensity to talk about things and how much are we funding. GM funds a lot of R&D, but they're not doing too well right now. So there's obviously something other than the inputs, and I think it does relate back to the relationships, and then also, what are some of those intangibles that you can't identify?
Duncan.
Sort of a follow-up to that, I think where I wanted to see a little discussion was about how do we encourage what's really unique about America and innovation in America. Getting to Susan's point about we have a lot of the raw ingredients already. We have to emphasize competition. That's what made us great. And so we need to reduce the barriers to getting the innovators to interact, not in a way that there's a national 10-point plan that we all agree on, but in a way that we reduce the barriers to getting a whole variety of different interactions going, because we don't know in advance which ones are going to be successful. And so, increasing the depth and complexity of our interactions by harnessing the competitiveness, not by eliminating it.
Any comments, reactions?
I tend to agree with that. I think that the thing I mentioned, which relates to both of these questions, is if you look at the areas where semiconductor technology is converging with other things, you can see tremendous opportunities there to improve the standard of living, to improve the quality of life, to improve the environment, to do big improvements in energy efficiency. Those are the things that we need to articulate and focus on. And to a large extent, the industry is trying to do that. The GM Research Laboratory is probably one of the best in the world for automotive research, and they're not doing well, but it's a more complicated problem than just utilizing the results of their research. There's a legacy cost associated with how they operate, which is dragging them down. And there's a lot of things involved in that. All of these problems are much more complicated if you start looking into them than they appear on the surface. But I still think that the answer to the questions here is run as fast as you can and look at the areas of convergence. That's where innovation is going to come from. And then fill the pipeline with good students to feed the university system, and you're ahead.
Let's see, I know there are a number of other questions. I apologize. We're running a little bit late. Maybe one more in the back right there.
Thanks. I'm Alex King. I'm the director of the Department of Energy's Ames Lab, and I'm an engineer. And engineers don't actually know very much, but they know a few things very, very well. One of the things they know very, very well is that if you don't measure the output, you're not controlling your system. And so I've been sitting here all day and I've been listening to ideas about inputs, things we could do to improve innovativeness and improve competitiveness. And they're all great ideas, and we should try all of them. But none of them will mean anything to us unless we measure their effect on the system. So my question to all the panel members, and I've heard it from one of you, Susan Butts, what are the measures by which we determine that we've become more innovative or more competitive?
Susan, you've already answered.
Yes, I mean, if I can just follow up, I think it's a wonderful question. And companies have a hard time sometimes defining metrics of success other than profit. But I think to the extent that we can come up with some really good measures of benefit to society, because if you go back to the whole idea of the federal government involvement or state government involvement, ultimately there has to be a benefit to society, to the taxpayers, that you can show for that. So I don't have an easy answer for you, but I totally agree that we need to focus on the right things, and the right things are the impacts and the outputs, not what we spent, but what we got back.
You know, and I had mentioned at the beginning, the most successful entities I've seen get pretty clear on outcomes, what it is they're trying to achieve. Larry?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we do in our research programs, each year we ask the companies that belong to identify compelling research reasons for the research that we funded. What came out of it that was compelling for your company? Mm-hmm. And it's rewarding to look at those. We get 100 or so from every company. Sometimes it's many more than that. But some of them say, one research result saved our company $150 million. Well, that's measuring the output, and it tells you that it was a very good research result, and that company now is going to be operating more effectively, more efficiently than it was before. So these compelling research reasons that we work with and how industry uses that research sort of gives you a measure of how valuable the research has been and where the output is going. It's being commercialized by the companies.
Thank you for your questions, everybody. Let's thank the panel here.